They told me my father died of a heart attack, but hearts don't fail when they're still fighting. I remember standing at his grave, the rain soaking through my black suit while mourners whispered condolences I couldn't hear, and all I could think about was how his hands had been warm just 3 days before when he gripped my shoulder and told me to remember that numbers never lie but people always do. 21 years old, barely graduated from university, and suddenly I was supposed to step into shoes that had walked through boardrooms where deals were made in whispers and empires crumbled over handshakes. The lawyer's voice droned on about assets and responsibilities, about the weight of the Ashford name, and I nodded like I understood any of it, like I wasn't drowning in a sea of grief and confusion and something else, something that felt like fear but tasted like suspicion. My mother stood beside me, her face hidden behind a black veil, and I wondered why she hadn't cried once since we found him collapsed in his study, why her hands were steady when she signed the death certificate, why she'd insisted on cremating certain documents before the lawyers arrived. But grief does strange things to people, I told myself. Grief makes us all into strangers. The offices of Ashford Industries occupied the top 15 floors of a glass tower in the heart of the financial district. And on my first day as CEO, I felt like an imposter walking through halls that echoed with my father's legacy. His portrait hung in the main lobby, oil on canvas, his eyes following me as I passed, and I could have sworn I saw disappointment in that painted gaze, like he knew I wasn't ready, like he knew I would fail. Margaret Chen, his executive assistant for 23 years, met me at the elevator with a tablet full of meeting schedules and a face that betrayed nothing, though I caught something flicker in her eyes when she handed me the keys to his office. "He believed in you," she said, and the words felt like a question rather than a statement. The office itself was exactly as he'd left it, the massive oak desk cluttered with papers he'd never finish reviewing, the leather chair still bearing the impression of his body, the crystal decanter of whiskey still half full because he'd always said he was saving it for a special occasion that never came. I sat in that chair and felt like a child playing at adulthood, spinning slowly while the city sprawled beneath me through floor-to-ceiling windows, and I wondered if everyone could see how lost I was or if the suit and the title provided enough camouflage to hide my inadequacy. The will was read in a conference room that smelled like old money and older secrets, and that's when the first cracks appeared in the reality I thought I understood. Arthur Pemberton, the family attorney whose firm had served the Ashfords for 3 generations, spread documents across the mahogany table with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or apprehension I couldn't tell. My mother sat across from me, her posture perfect, her face arranged in an expression of patient grief that seemed rehearsed, and beside her was a man I didn't recognize, someone she introduced as Martin Newman, a financial advisor who'd been helping her manage personal accounts. I didn't think to question his presence then. I was too focused on the papers, on the legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate, on the numbers that didn't add up no matter how many times I calculated them in my head. "There are certain provisions," Pemberton said, clearing his throat, "that your father added in the months before his passing. Amendments to the original document that are unusual." The word hung in the air like smoke, and I leaned forward, suddenly alert in a way I hadn't been since the funeral. "Properties transferred to my name 6 months ago when I was still 20 years old and had never discussed real estate with my father. Investment accounts redirected through a series of trusts I'd never heard of, each one named after obscure astronomical phenomena: Cygnus Trust, Orion Holdings, Nebula Investments." A clause that prevented any audio or video recordings of board meetings for a period of 18 months following his death, which Pemberton called a posthumous silence provision, and which made absolutely no legal sense to anyone in the room except perhaps my mother, whose lips pressed together in a thin line when she heard it. I should have asked questions then, demanded explanations, insisted that Pemberton walk me through every amendment and addendum until I understood exactly what my father had been planning. But I was 21 and grieving and overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what I'd inherited, and I told myself there would be time later to untangle the knots my father had left behind. Instead, I signed where they told me to sign, initialed where they told me to initial, and watched as my entire life changed with the stroke of a pen that felt too heavy in my hand. Pemberton gathered the documents with visible relief, avoiding my eyes, and I caught him exchange a glance with my mother that seemed loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his briefcase for a sealed envelope. "Your father left specific instructions that this be delivered to you personally, to be opened only when you were alone." The envelope was thick, made of heavy cream-colored paper that felt expensive against my fingers, and my father's handwriting spelled my name across the front in the bold strokes I remembered from birthday cards and permission slips, and the single letter he'd written me during my first year at boarding school. I tucked it into my jacket pocket without opening it, suddenly desperate to be anywhere but in that room with its watching eyes and heavy silences, and I excused myself with some vague promise to review everything later. Later turned into 3 weeks of chaos. 3 weeks of learning that running a multinational corporation was nothing like the business classes I'd taken or the summer internships my father had arranged. Board members circled like sharks scenting blood, testing my decisions, questioning my authority, and I spent more hours than I could count in meetings where everyone spoke in euphemisms and no one said what they actually meant. The envelope sat unopened in my desk drawer, a weight I could feel even when I wasn't looking at it, and every night I told myself I'd read it tomorrow when I was less exhausted, when I had time to properly absorb whatever my father had wanted to tell me. The companies under our umbrella ranged from shipping to software to pharmaceutical research, and understanding each one felt like learning a new language while simultaneously trying to speak it fluently. I made mistakes. Small ones at first, easily corrected, easily hidden from the board. But then I approved a merger without properly reviewing the debt obligations, and suddenly we were exposed to liabilities that threatened to destabilize our entire European division. The newspapers called me the boy CEO and Ashford's unfortunate heir, and I read every article with burning cheeks and clenched fists, wondering if my father was watching from somewhere and regretting his faith in me. That's when Victor Reinhardt appeared, though at the time his arrival seemed like salvation rather than invasion. He walked into my office without an appointment, bypassing Margaret with a smile that could charm paint off walls, and introduced himself as an old friend of my father's who wanted to help. Frederick and I went back decades, he said, settling into the chair across from my desk like he owned it, like he belonged there in a way I still didn't. We had our differences over the years, disagreements about methodology and philosophy, but I respected him, and I know he would have wanted someone to guide you through these early days. Victor was everything I wasn't, confident without arrogance, experienced without condescension, charming in a way that felt genuine rather than practiced. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suits were impeccably tailored, and when he spoke about business, his eyes lit up with passion that made me believe he actually cared about the companies and the people who worked for them rather than just the profit margins. He offered advice on the merger crisis, connected me with lawyers who specialized in debt restructuring, and within 2 weeks, we'd turned a potential disaster into a strategic advantage that made the board look at me with something other than barely concealed contempt. I trusted him. God help me, I trusted him completely, and why wouldn't I? He appeared when I needed help most. He asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to honor his friendship with my father. And he seemed genuinely invested in my success in a world where everyone else was waiting for me to fail. We had dinner together every Thursday night, talking about everything from market strategies to personal philosophy, and he shared stories about my father that made me feel connected to a man I was only beginning to realize I'd never truly known. Frederick was complicated, Victor told me one evening, swirling wine in a glass that cost more than my first car. He saw the world in terms of systems and patterns, always looking for the hidden architecture beneath the surface. It made him brilliant at business but sometimes difficult as a friend. He trusted very few people, your father, but he trusted you. He told me once that you were the only pure thing in his life, the only person he hadn't corrupted with his cynicism. I wanted to believe that, wanted to believe my father saw me as something more than a legacy placeholder, and Victor's words filled a void I hadn't known existed. He became my mentor in all the ways my father had never been, teaching me not just business but how to navigate the complex social dynamics of the wealthy elite, how to read rooms and manipulate perceptions, how to project confidence even when I was terrified. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Victor had begun infiltrating my company 6 weeks before my father's death, using a proxy merchant named Thomas Grady to purchase minority stakes in 3 of our subsidiary companies. Grady was unremarkable in every way, the kind of man you forgot the moment he left the room, and he'd used that anonymity to slip beneath our radar while reporting every detail of our operations back to Victor. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity: position himself as ally, become indispensable, and then exploit the trust he'd built to achieve objectives I couldn't yet imagine. Enemy to ally to friend. That was the trajectory Victor had mapped out for our relationship, and I followed it like a tourist following a trail through unfamiliar woods, never suspecting that the path led somewhere dangerous. The merger crisis that had seemed like bad luck was actually carefully engineered by Victor's people, a pressure point designed to make me vulnerable, to make me grateful, to make me dependent on his guidance. Every piece of advice he offered came with strings attached that I couldn't see, and every connection he provided came with loyalties that weren't to me. I was being played by a master, and I smiled and thanked him for the privilege. The first month of my tenure bled into the second, and slowly, incrementally, I began to find my footing. The board stopped looking at me like a liability and started treating me like an actual executive, and the newspapers moved on to fresher scandals, leaving me to rebuild my reputation in relative obscurity. I hired new staff, reorganized several departments, and implemented a transparency initiative that my father would have hated, but that the employees seemed to appreciate. Victor was there through all of it, a constant presence at meetings and dinners and late-night phone calls when I needed to talk through a difficult decision. He introduced me to his network, powerful men and women who moved through circles my father had kept me away from, and I networked and negotiated and slowly built a reputation of my own that wasn't just reflected glory from my father's name. My mother watched all of this from a distance, rarely visiting the office, rarely calling, and when we did speak, our conversations were stilted and formal, two strangers performing the roles of mother and son without any of the underlying warmth. I told myself she was grieving in her own way, that some people processed loss through withdrawal rather than connection, but something about her silence felt deliberate, like she was waiting for something to happen. The envelope remained unopened. Every time I reached for it, something stopped me: an urgent meeting, an important call, the simple cowardice of not wanting to face whatever message my father had left behind. I told myself I was honoring his memory by stabilizing the company first, by proving I deserved whatever words he'd written, but the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was afraid. Afraid that the letter would confirm my worst suspicions about myself, that my father had seen through the facade of competence I'd built and known I wasn't ready, would never be ready, could never fill the space he'd left behind. The envelope became a symbol of everything I was avoiding, and I developed elaborate rituals around not looking at it, keeping my desk drawer closed, sitting in chairs that faced away from where it lay hidden. Margaret noticed everything, and one day she asked, with the particular gentleness of someone who knows they're overstepping, if perhaps I might want to read it before too much time passed. "Some messages have expiration dates," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me wonder what she knew, what my father had told her that he hadn't told me. But I smiled and thanked her for her concern and continued my elaborate game of avoidance, never suspecting that the message inside would eventually become the only thing keeping me alive. 3 months after my father's death, I found myself working late on a Friday night, reviewing quarterly projections that seemed optimistic in ways that made me suspicious. The building was empty except for security, and the silence felt heavy, oppressive, like the tower itself was holding its breath. I'd been avoiding my father's personal effects, the boxes of belongings that human resources had packed up and stored in a closet adjacent to my office, but something about the stillness of that night made me brave in a way I hadn't been before. I opened the closet door and found a mountain of cardboard boxes, each one labeled with Margaret's neat handwriting: personal correspondence, photographs, awards and certificates, MISC. I started with the photographs, flipping through images of a man I recognized but didn't know, my father at various ages and in various contexts, shaking hands with politicians and business leaders, standing stiffly beside my mother at social events, and occasionally, rarely, holding a child who looked like me but couldn't possibly be me because I didn't remember any of these moments. There were gaps in the timeline, years missing, and I wondered who had curated this collection and what criteria they'd used to decide what deserved preservation. The MISC box was larger than the others, and when I opened it, I found a chaos of objects that seemed to have no connection. Old keys, broken watches, receipts faded past legibility, and at the very bottom, a locked metal cabinet the size of a shoebox. The cabinet was incongruously heavy, made of some material I couldn't identify, and the lock was unlike anything I'd seen before: no keyhole, no combination dial, just a smooth surface with a single small depression that seemed designed for a fingerprint. On impulse, I pressed my thumb to the depression, expecting nothing, and jumped when the cabinet clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the empty office. Inside, I found 3 external hard drives, a folder of printed photographs, a bundle of audio cassettes that seemed almost comically outdated, and a USB drive with a label that read in my father's handwriting, Classic 001. The words meant nothing to me, but the fact that they were hidden, protected, locked away with biometric security suggested they meant everything. I should have called someone, Victor, Margaret, my mother, but something stopped me, some instinct I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Instead, I tucked the USB drive into my pocket, returned the cabinet to the box, and closed the closet door, my heart pounding with an emotion I couldn't name. I waited until I was home to insert the drive into my personal laptop, and even then I hesitated, staring at the icon that appeared on my desktop like it might contain something explosive. The folder structure that loaded was meticulous, obsessively organized in a way that reminded me painfully of my father, and I spent the first hour just exploring the hierarchy without opening any individual files. There were folders labeled with names I didn't recognize, folders labeled with dates spanning more than 20 years, folders labeled with cryptic codes that seemed to follow some pattern I couldn't decipher. The photographs I'd found in the cabinet were digitized here, but there were thousands more, surveillance images taken with telephoto lenses, candid shots of men in suits entering and exiting buildings, license plates and faces and locations mapped with precision that bordered on obsessive. One folder was labeled family, and I opened it with trembling fingers, expecting more photographs of myself as a child. More memories I'd somehow forgotten. What I found was a dossier on my mother that stretched back to before my birth, financial records and phone logs and photographs of her with men I didn't recognize, everything annotated with my father's observations in a clinical, detached tone that made me feel sick. Suspected affair with a men confirm, read one note dated 3 years ago. Meeting at Criterion 7 p.m., duration 3 hours, read another. Financial transfer to offshore account connection to obsidian. The word meant nothing to me then. Obsidian, a type of volcanic glass, black and sharp, used by ancient peoples to make tools and weapons. But the way my father had written it, with that question mark that seemed to contain multitudes, suggested it was something else entirely, something he'd spent years trying to understand. I dug deeper into the folders, following threads that led to more threads, and slowly, over hours that felt like minutes, a picture began to emerge. My father had been investigating something or someone for at least the past decade. He'd compiled evidence with the patience of a man who knew he was building a case that might never be prosecuted, that might never see the light of day. And buried in the deepest folder, nested within encryption that took me 3 hours and every password I could think of to crack, I found what he'd been looking for: the Obsidian Circle. The name was almost laughably dramatic, like something from a spy novel or a conspiracy theory forum, but the evidence my father had gathered was anything but fictional. Meeting minutes, organizational charts, financial flows that traced to shell companies and offshore accounts, and most damning of all, a list of names with dates next to them. Names I recognized from news articles, dates that corresponded to deaths. I sat in the darkness of my apartment, the laptop screen casting blue shadows across my face, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. According to my father's files, the Obsidian Circle was a collective, not quite a corporation, not quite a club, but something in between, made up of wealthy and powerful individuals who had found a more efficient way to eliminate obstacles than traditional competition. They didn't murder people, not in any way that could be traced or prosecuted. They engineered circumstances. A business rival would suddenly face a tax investigation that destroyed his company. A whistleblower would develop a rare medical condition that required immediate, all-consuming treatment. A politician who opposed their interests would find himself caught in a scandal so perfectly constructed that it could only have been artificial. And sometimes, when subtlety wasn't enough, accidents happened. Car crashes with no witnesses. House fires that started in electrical systems recently certified as safe. Heart attacks and otherwise healthy men who had been in the way of progress. I thought of my father, collapsed in his study, the paramedics saying there was nothing they could do, my mother standing in the doorway with dry eyes and steady hands. I thought of the amendments to his will, the properties transferred, the surveillance trusts, the posthumous silence clause. And for the first time since he died, I began to wonder if his heart had failed him, or if someone had failed it on his behalf. The audio files were worse than the documents. I listened to them with headphones, volume low, as if someone might overhear in my empty apartment. My father's voice, tired but determined, dictating observations and theories into a recorder that captured the scratch of his pen as he wrote. March 15th. Confirmed connection between Reinhardt Industries and the Nebula Shell Company. Victor continues to deny any involvement, but the financial trails are undeniable. He's positioned himself as mentor to several young executives over the years, each of whom experienced catastrophic failures within 5 years of accepting his guidance. 3 deaths, 2 bankruptcies, 1 disappearance. Pattern suggests recruitment strategy: identify promising talent, compromise them through manufactured dependency, either absorb into the network or eliminate. Must protect Alexander at all costs. I had to stop the recording, had to breathe through the tightness in my chest, had to remind myself that what I was hearing was real, that my father had known, had suspected Victor long before Victor appeared in my office with his silver hair and charming smile. The man I had trusted, the mentor I had embraced, was the very enemy my father had spent years tracking, and I had invited him into every aspect of my life with gratitude. The camera feeds were the hardest to watch. My father had installed surveillance in places I never would have suspected: his home office, his bedroom, the private conference room he used for sensitive meetings, and the footage stretched back years, thousands of hours of documentation that must have taken him weeks to review and annotate. I found the files labeled with dates from the month before his death and forced myself to watch, looking for something, anything that would explain what he had known and when he had known it. Most of it was mundane: my father working late, my father sleeping restlessly, my father packing and muttering to himself in ways I recognized but had never understood. And then I found the file from the night of April 3rd, 3 days before he died, and everything changed. The footage showed my father in his study, not alone, speaking to a woman I didn't recognize, a severe-looking figure in a dark suit who stood with military precision and listened without expression as he spoke. "I've made the necessary arrangements," my father said, and his voice was steady despite the exhaustion visible in every line of his face. "The will has been amended. The transfers are complete. If anything happens to me, everything goes to Alexander, but the real inheritance is protected. Classic 001 will activate if and when he's ready. You'll know when that is." The woman nodded once crisply. "And if he's never ready," my father smiled, but it was a sad smile, a smile that acknowledged possibilities he didn't want to face. "Then at least he'll be safe. That's all I've ever wanted for him. Safety. Let me carry the burden of knowing. Let him inherit something clean." I paused the footage, staring at my father's face frozen on the screen, and felt something shift inside me that I knew could never shift back. He had known. He had known something was coming, had suspected it was coming, had made preparations for my protection that I hadn't understood until this moment. The transfers and trusts that seemed suspicious were actually shields, designed to protect my inheritance from people who might try to claim it or destroy it. The posthumous silence clause prevented anyone from recording board meetings where sensitive information might be discussed, information that could be used against me if I wasn't careful. And Classic 001, whatever it was, whatever it contained, was meant to be found by me, meant to be activated when I was ready to understand, meant to give me weapons my father had been too cautious or too careful to use himself. I reached for the envelope in my jacket pocket, the letter I'd avoided for 3 months, and finally broke the seal with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. My father's handwriting covered 3 pages, cramped and urgent, the words of a man who knew he was running out of time. "Alexander," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then my suspicions were correct and my precautions were necessary. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you any of this directly. Your innocence was the only protection I could give you, and I needed you to appear uninvolved for as long as possible. By now you've probably found Classic 001. By now you've probably started to understand the shape of what I've spent years documenting. I don't know how much time you have, but I need you to understand something fundamental. Trust is a weapon, and it can be used against you more effectively than any knife or gun. The people who will try to get close to you in the coming months are not your friends. They are hunters and you are prey, and the only way to survive is to become a hunter yourself. I raised you soft because I wanted you to have the childhood I never had, but I always knew there would come a time when you'd need the hardness I kept hidden. Find that hardness now, Alexander. Find it and use it, and don't apologize for what it makes you. Your mother is not who you think she is. Neither is Victor Reinhardt, neither is Martin Newman. The evidence is in the files. Follow the threads, trust the patterns, and never, never forget that I loved you more than I loved my own survival. That's why I'm probably dead, because I chose your safety over my own, and I would make that choice again 1,000 times without regret. Be careful, be clever. And when the time comes, be ruthless, your father." I read the letter 3 times, then put it down and stared at nothing for what felt like hours. The man who had raised me, the man I thought I knew, had been living a double life for years. The distraction and distance I'd interpreted as workaholism were actually the symptoms of a secret war he'd been waging without my knowledge. And he'd died, been killed, possibly murdered, protecting me from a threat I hadn't known existed. The grief I felt wasn't the simple sorrow of loss. It was something more complicated, grief mixed with anger, mixed with a strange, fierce pride that my father had seen the danger and faced it anyway, had documented everything so that I could understand, had given me weapons even from beyond the grave. I thought about Victor, about the dinners and the advice and the apparently genuine warmth he'd shown me, and felt my stomach turn. Every moment of our friendship had been calculated, every kindness a manipulation, and I'd swallowed it all like a fool desperate for approval. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. My father had spent years gathering evidence without acting on it, had died before he could bring the Obsidian Circle to justice, and now that evidence was mine. I could take it to the police, but the files suggested members of law enforcement were compromised. I could take it to the press, but the Circle's influence extended to media organizations as well. Whatever I did, I would be painting a target on my back that was already there but not yet visible. I made a decision that night that would define everything that followed. I would tell no one. I would keep my discovery secret, continue playing the role of naive young CEO, continue trusting Victor and accepting his guidance while quietly verifying every piece of information my father had gathered. If the Obsidian Circle was as powerful as the files suggested, my only advantage was their belief in my ignorance. The moment they suspected I knew, I would become a liability that needed to be eliminated, just like my father. So I hid the hard drives, encrypted the files with passwords only I would know, and went back to my life as if nothing had changed. It was the hardest performance I've ever given. Every meeting with Victor became an exercise in studied normality, laughing at his jokes while wondering if he'd had my father killed, accepting his advice while knowing his motives were corrupt. Every conversation with my mother became a careful dance of evasion, avoiding topics that might reveal my suspicions while trying to understand the depth of her betrayal. And every night, alone in my apartment, I would review the files, study the patterns, and add my own observations to my father's documentation. The war he'd been fighting was now my war. I just had to survive long enough to win it. The corporate world continued turning regardless of my personal revelations, and the next 6 months brought challenges that would have been overwhelming even without the weight of secret knowledge pressing down on me. A competitor attempted a hostile takeover that required delicate negotiations and several sleepless weeks to defeat. One of our pharmaceutical subsidiaries faced a regulatory investigation that threatened to destroy decades of research. And Victor, ever helpful, ever present, guided me through each crisis with advice that was somehow always useful, always exactly what I needed to hear. I began to understand what my father meant about manufactured dependency. Victor was creating situations where I couldn't succeed without him, building a debt of gratitude that he would eventually call due. The proxy merchant, Thomas Grady, appeared occasionally at board meetings, his minority stakes in our subsidiaries giving him voting rights that always seemed to align with Victor's interests. I pretended not to notice the pattern, pretended to be grateful for Victor's continued support, and kept meticulous records of every move they made. My mother remained distant, but I began engineering reasons to see her, casual dinners and family obligations that allowed me to observe her behavior while appearing merely dutiful. She had changed since my father's death, becoming more involved with Martin Newman, the financial advisor who'd been present at the Wool reading. They were seen together frequently, at restaurants and galas, and the kind of private functions that suggested intimacy rather than professional relationship. I found evidence in my father's files that confirmed their affair had begun at least 3 years before his death, and that Newman had been advising my mother to make financial moves that benefited the Obsidian Circle's interests. Wire transfers to accounts connected to shell companies, investment redirections that created vulnerabilities in our corporate structure, small decisions that individually seemed insignificant but collectively formed a pattern of deliberate sabotage. My mother, it seemed, had been working against my father for years, undermining his position while pretending to support it. The question I couldn't answer was whether she'd known about the circle directly or had simply been manipulated by Newman into serving their purposes. Either way, she was complicit. Either way, she had helped destroy my father. And either way, I couldn't confront her without revealing that I knew that I had found the files, that I was no longer the innocent son she believed me to be. The breakthrough came 8 months after my father's death, during a routine review of company communications. Margaret had flagged an email exchange that seemed anomalous, a series of messages between Victor and an unknown address, routed through our corporate servers despite Victor having no official role in our organization. The content was encrypted, but I'd been learning, teaching myself the skills my father had used to uncover the circle's activities, and after 3 days of work I cracked the cipher. The messages were discussions of something called Project Renaissance, a coordinated effort to gain controlling interest in Ashford Industries through a combination of stock manipulation, legal pressure, and what the messages referred to obliquely as succession contingencies. The timeline suggested the project had been in planning for at least 2 years, with my father's death serving as an accelerant that moved everything forward. Victor had never been my mentor. He had been my replacement, groomed to take over my company once I'd been sufficiently weakened or removed. The messages ended with a summary that made my blood run cold. The sun is performing better than expected but remains manageable. Recommend continued cultivation for the next 12 months before moving to Phase 3. The circle concurs. Phase 3, I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it meant me, knew it meant danger, knew it meant I was running out of time to prepare. I spent the next month building escape routes, not physical escapes but corporate ones. I restructured several subsidiaries to make them more resistant to hostile acquisition. I cultivated relationships with board members who weren't connected to Victor's network, building loyalties that might prove useful if things went wrong. I created phantom projects and false expansion plans, paper trails that would confuse anyone trying to track the actual direction of the company. And I began, slowly and carefully, to leak information that I controlled, feeding Victor data that was technically accurate but strategically useless, making him believe he understood my thinking when he was actually seeing only what I wanted him to see. It was exhausting work maintaining two identities, the naive CEO who trusted his mentor and the secret combatant who was preparing for war, but it was also clarifying. I understood finally why my father had seemed so distant during my childhood, why he'd worked such long hours, why he'd never seemed fully present even when he was physically there. He'd been fighting the same fight I was now fighting, carrying the same weight, and he'd done it alone because he'd wanted to protect me from the knowledge. I didn't have anyone to protect. I didn't have anyone at all. The loneliness of those months was almost unbearable. I had colleagues but no friends, family but no allies, a fortune but no one to share it with. Victor was the closest thing I had to a confidant, and he was my enemy. My mother was the only family I had left, and she had betrayed my father, might have helped kill him, and was probably working against me as well. Margaret was loyal, I believed, but I couldn't risk telling her what I knew, couldn't risk making her a target by sharing the burden of my suspicions. So I carried it alone just as my father had, and I felt myself changing under the weight, hardening into someone I didn't always recognize. The soft young man who'd stood at his father's grave was becoming something else, something colder and more calculating, someone capable of smiling at his enemy while planning that enemy's destruction. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself my father would understand. But late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I wondered if I was becoming the very thing I was fighting against, if the war was changing me into someone who could have belonged to the Obsidian Circle, someone who saw people as pieces on a board rather than human beings with their own hopes and fears. The thought terrified me, but it didn't stop me from planning. 11 months after my father's death, I received a message that changed everything again. It came through a channel I hadn't known existed, a secure communication protocol that activated automatically on my laptop. The program apparently installed by my father and dormant until triggered by some condition I didn't understand. The message was from someone calling themselves Vogel, and it contained only a name, a location, and a time. Dr. Elias Vogel, St. Catherine's Hospital. Tuesday, 3 p.m., come alone, your father would want you to. I spent 3 days trying to decide whether to go. It could be a trap, someone using my father's memory to lure me into a vulnerable position. It could be a test, Victor, or the circle checking to see if I could be manipulated through appeals to filial loyalty. But the protocol that delivered the message was buried deep in my system, installed with sophistication that suggested my father's hand, and the name Vogel appeared in Classic 001's files as a trusted contact, someone my father had consulted on medical matters. Against my better judgment, against every instinct for self-preservation I'd developed, I went. St. Catherine's Hospital was a private medical facility on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the wealthy went to receive treatments they didn't want anyone to know about. Dr. Elias Vogel met me in a garden on the hospital grounds, a frail-looking man in his 70s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "You look like him," he said, which was what everyone said, but there was something different in how he said it, something that suggested he was comparing me not just to photographs but to memories. "Your father was a good man, a complicated man but a good one. He asked me to contact you if certain conditions were met, and those conditions have now been met." I waited, unsure what to say, and Vogel studied me with an expression I couldn't read. "He knew," Vogel said finally. "He knew they were going to kill him, knew it for months before it happened. He could have run, could have exposed them, could have gone to authorities who might have listened. But he stayed and he prepared and he died because he believed that was the only way to keep you safe." The words hit me like blows, and I had to steady myself against a garden bench to keep from falling. "Why?" I managed. "Why didn't he fight back?" Vogel smiled sadly. "He did fight back. Everything he did in his final months was fighting back. The will amendments, the asset transfers, Classic 001. He was building an arsenal for you, weapons you could use when you were ready, evidence that could destroy the circle if deployed correctly. He couldn't use them himself because they were watching too closely, because any move he made would have been countered before it had any effect. But you they underestimate, you they think is harmless. That's your father's final gift to you, Alexander. The power of their contempt." Vogel talked for 3 hours, filling in gaps that the files had left empty, explaining connections I hadn't understood, answering questions I hadn't known to ask. He told me about the circle's structure, the hierarchy of influence that kept everyone implicated and everyone silent. He told me about Victor's role, not as a leader but as a recruiter and enforcer, someone who identified threats and either neutralized or absorbed them. He told me about my mother's involvement, which was more complicated than I'd understood. She hadn't joined the circle willingly but had been manipulated and compromised until she had no choice but to cooperate. "She believes Martin Newman loves her," Vogel said with something like pity. "She believes he'll protect her from the consequences of what she's done. She's wrong, of course. No one protects anyone in the circle. They use each other until there's nothing left to use." I asked about my father's death, about whether it had really been murder, and Vogel's answer was more disturbing than a simple yes. They didn't kill him directly. They created conditions that made his heart failure inevitable. Stress, chemical exposure, systematic undermining of his physical and mental health. It's their preferred method, no violence, no evidence, just a body that stopped working because it couldn't work anymore. Your father knew what they were doing. He let them do it because every day he survived was another day to prepare, another day to make you ready. He chose his death, Alexander. He chose when and how it would happen, and he used the time he had left to give you everything you'd need to survive. I left the hospital that evening with a new understanding of who my father had been and what he'd sacrificed. The distance I'd felt from him my whole life wasn't coldness or indifference. It was protection, the deliberate creation of space between us so that his enemies wouldn't see me as a threat, wouldn't target me before I was ready to fight back. Every harsh word, every missed birthday, every moment of apparent disinterest was actually an act of love so profound that I couldn't fully comprehend it. He had died for me. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, deliberately, letting them kill him piece by piece while he built the weapons I would need to avenge him. The weight of that knowledge was almost crushing. I wasn't just inheriting a company or a fortune, I was inheriting a responsibility, a mission, a war that my father had started and I was expected to finish. Could I do it? Could I be the person he believed I could be, the ruthless strategist he described in his letter, the hunter who could track and destroy the people who'd taken everything from him? I didn't know, but I was going to find out. The final piece of Classic 001 activated 3 weeks later, when I entered a specific string of characters into a search field that had seemed non-functional. What loaded was a video file, the last recording my father ever made, filmed in his study 2 days before he died. He looked exhausted but peaceful, like a man who had made his peace with what was coming, and when he spoke his voice was steady despite the visible tremors in his hands. "Alexander," he said. "If you're watching this, then Vogel has contacted you and you've passed the tests I embedded in the system. You're ready, or as ready as you'll ever be. The footage I'm about to show you is the reason they killed me. It proves not just the Circle's existence but its methods, its membership, its crimes stretching back decades. If this footage goes public, it will destroy them. But if this footage goes public before you're prepared, it will destroy you first. They have people everywhere: law enforcement, judiciary, media. Any exposure attempt that isn't perfectly coordinated will be suppressed, and anyone involved will be eliminated. I never found a way to use this evidence without triggering a response that would have killed us both. Maybe you will. Maybe you're smarter than me, more ruthless, more willing to take the risks I couldn't take. Or maybe you'll decide that some battles aren't worth fighting, that safety is more important than justice. I won't judge you either way. I just needed you to know the truth. I needed someone to know. The video shifted to surveillance footage, board meetings, and private conversations and moments that should have been impossible to capture, and I watched as the Obsidian Circle revealed itself in all its terrible clarity. The next year was the loneliest of my life, and also the most purposeful. I stopped pretending I didn't know what I was dealing with and started actively preparing for confrontation. Victor continued his cultivation of me, never suspecting that his protege had become his opponent. My mother continued her relationship with Martin Newman, never knowing that I had documented every meeting, every transaction, every whispered conversation that proved her complicity. And I continued playing my role: the grateful CEO, the innocent heir, the boy who didn't know he was surrounded by enemies. But beneath the performance, I was building something: an organization, a network of my own, people I'd vetted and tested and trusted with pieces of the truth, never the whole picture but enough to make them useful. I learned to think like my father had thought. In systems and patterns, seeing the hidden architecture beneath the surface of every interaction. I learned to be patient, to wait for opportunities rather than forcing them, to let my enemies reveal themselves through their own actions. And I learned something my father had never quite mastered: how to be ruthless without losing myself, how to fight a war without becoming the thing I was fighting against. Confrontation, when it finally came, was nothing like I'd imagined. There was no dramatic showdown, no climactic battle, no moment where I could point to victory and say this is where I won. Instead, it was a process, a gradual dismantling that took years rather than months, a strategic campaign that wore down my enemies without ever directly engaging them. I leaked information through channels they couldn't trace, seeding doubt and paranoia among Circle members who had trusted each other for decades. I manipulated markets in ways that benefited my company while threatening their interests, forcing them to waste resources defending positions they thought were secure. I cultivated relationships with journalists and prosecutors who weren't compromised, building cases that could be triggered when the time was right. And I waited, watching Victor's confidence slowly erode, watching my mother's certainty falter, watching the Circle's unity fracture under the pressure of suspicion and fear. They had built their power on trust and mutual implication, everyone equally guilty and equally protected, but I had learned from my father that trust could be weaponized, that the same bonds that held them together could be used to tear them apart. When Victor finally turned on Martin Newman, denouncing him to authorities in exchange for immunity, I wasn't surprised. When my mother, abandoned by the man she believed loved her, came to me with confession and pleas for forgiveness, I wasn't moved. When the Circle collapsed, not with a bang but with the quiet unraveling of an organization that had forgotten how to trust itself, I didn't celebrate. I just moved forward the way my father would have wanted, the way he'd trained me to move without knowing he was training me. It would be easy to say I emerged from this unscathed, that I defeated my enemies and rebuilt my father's legacy, and lived happily ever after in the manner of storybook heroes. But that's not how war works. The person who started this journey died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone harder and colder and more capable of terrible things. I destroyed people who deserved destruction, but I also destroyed people whose only crime was being connected to people who deserved destruction. I manipulated and deceived and used people as instruments rather than treating them as ends in themselves. I became, in other words, exactly what my father feared I might become, exactly what he'd tried to protect me from, exactly what the Circle would have made me if they'd succeeded in their recruitment. The difference, I tell myself, is that I chose this. They didn't corrupt me, I corrupted myself deliberately and with full knowledge of what I was losing. That has to count for something. That has to mean the sacrifice wasn't in vain. The evidence still exists, hidden in places only I know, protected by encryption that will outlast me. Classic 001 has been updated and expanded. a comprehensive record of everything I've done and everything that's been done to me, ready to be released if certain conditions are ever met. I've become my father in more ways than I ever intended, carrying secrets that I can never share, fighting battles that no one will ever know about, protecting people who don't know they need protection. The Ashford name means something different now than it did when I first inherited it, something harder and darker and more powerful. We're not just a company anymore, we're a force, a network of influence that stretches into places my father never reached, that has capabilities he never imagined. Is this what he wanted for me? I don't know, I never got to ask him, and the records he left don't answer questions about intent, only about action. But I like to think he'd be proud, or at least satisfied, that his sacrifices weren't wasted, that the weapons he built were used the way he designed them to be used, that his son survived long enough to control the truth. Inheritance, I've learned, is never about what you receive, it's about what you become in the receiving. My father left me a company, but what I actually inherited was a transformation, a journey from innocence to experience that cost me everything I thought I valued and gave me something I never knew I needed. I'm not the man I was at 21, standing in the rain at a funeral and believing I understood grief. I am not the naive CEO who trusted Victor Reinhardt because trust was easier than suspicion. I am not my father's son, not anymore, though I carry his name and his memories and the weight of his choices. I am something new, something forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by the cold water of truth. The war is over, or at least this phase of it is, but I know there will be other wars, other enemies, other moments when I have to choose between safety and justice, between the person I want to be and the person I have to be. And when those moments come, I will remember my father's letter, his final instructions, his belief that hardness and love could coexist in the same heart. The files are waiting, cataloged and organized and ready for whoever comes after me. Classic 002, I've named them, the second generation of evidence and truth and weapons that might someday save someone the way my father's files saved me. I don't know who will find them, don't know what kind of person will inherit this burden after I'm gone, but I've tried to leave them everything they'll need to understand, everything they'll need to survive, everything they'll need to continue the work that my father started and I continued. Because that's what inheritance really is, I've come to understand. It's not money or property or the material accumulation of a lifetime. It's knowledge passed from one generation to the next, growing and adapting and becoming something more than any individual could create alone. My father gave me his knowledge and I've added my own, and someday someone else will add theirs and the chain will continue long after all of us are forgotten. That's immortality. That's legacy. That's the only thing that survives when the bodies are buried and the wills are read and the wars are won or lost. I buried my father believing I inherited a company. What I actually inherited was the truth and the terrible responsibility of deciding what to do with it. Well, that was a wild ride, wasn't it? If you felt the same chill I did when Julian uncovered Classic 001, smash that like button right now. It tells YouTube, hey, this story slaps, and helps more mystery lovers find ready stories. Before you go, I've got a quick favor to ask. Comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Are you in Mumbai, Toronto, Berlin, Jakarta, or hiding in a basement like Julian? Globe showing Europe, Africa. I love seeing how far our Ready Stories community stretches. Your location makes this channel feel like a global secret society. And if you don't want to miss the next chapter, where Julian's world gets even darker, smash that subscribe button. But wait, after you subscribe, turn on post notifications so YouTube sends you an instant alert the moment a new video drops. You absolutely do not want to miss what happens when the Obsidian Circle strikes back. Thanks for riding this roller coaster with me. Stay sharp, stay curious, and remember, in the world of Ready Stories, the truth is always watching.